Everyone knows you, Karl. You were born in Trier in 1818 and died in London in 1883. And more or less everyone knows that you have something to do with communism, class struggle, revolution, things like that. But how did you actually become Karl Marx?
Oh, that's a good question. To be honest, it wasn't planned. I first studied law in the city of Bonn in Germany. That's out of passion, more out of a reason, and because of my father. 1 year later, I went to Berlin and completed my studies there in 1841, if I remember correctly. However, I was less interested in law than in philosophy. So I submitted a doctoral thesis in philosophy at the University of Jena shortly later. It dealt with the natural philosophy of Democritus and Epicurus.
And then you became a professor.
I never got a teaching position. Must be kidding. I was considered too uncomfortable from the start. Always critical and politically radical. For the Prussian authorities, I was more of a problem than a scholar. And then an atheist on top of that.
I always thought you were Jewish.
I was of Jewish origin, yes, but I never practiced Judaism. My father had even converted to Protestantism for pragmatic reasons, because Jews were not allowed to practice many professions at the time. So as a result, I was also a Protestant as a young man, but later, as you know, I became very critical of religion.
Instead, you turned to philosophy.
Exactly. I wanted to understand why the world is the way it is and why so many people remain poor while a few become richer and richer. And that question never left me.
So, no professorship, no church, but a lot of philosophy. But that doesn't turn you into the famous Karl Marx.
Perhaps a decisive factor was that I started working as a journalist after my studies. I wrote for newspapers and quickly realized that criticism of the state and society was not particularly well received. My articles were censored, newspapers were banned, and I had to move constantly. The Paris, Brussels, Cologne, London. The being in exile was kind of my permanent situation.
So, out of frustration, you turned to the idea of revolution?
More out of observation, I would say. I saw how industrial society was emerging. Factories, machines, hard labor, and at the same time, poverty, misery, death. It increasingly became clear to me that this was not a coincidence, but there was a system behind it.
And that's where class struggle comes in.
Exactly. I saw that society was divided. On the one side, those who own factories, machines, and the capital, and on the other side, those who own nothing but their labor. These two groups have conflicting interests. Here, the bourgeoisie, and there, the proletariat. Capitalists on the one hand, and workers on the other.
Sounds like a real conflict.
Yes, so my argument was that history is essentially a developing series of class struggles. Not of great heroes, but of social conflicts between defined groups. as Hegel would have said, between thesis and antithesis.
And that's why you call for a synthesis, namely communism?
Well, I was never interested in preaching morality. I wanted to understand how the system works, why it exploits people. For me, communism was not a utopia, but a possible consequence of this analysis.
But you didn't do this all on your own.
No, it is a very important Friedrich Engels, a factory's owner's son, who was interested in philosophy and economics and whom I met around 1840. Without Engels, certainly I would not have been able to write much. I simply could not afford it. Engels earned the money and he knew factories from his own experience. I analyzed them and wrote about them.
Notably in Das Kapital.
Yes, this volume was published in 1867, a rather thick book about a rather complicated topic.
But you became famous nonetheless.
Famous, yes, in agreement with what happened later in my name, not really.
We can try to clarify that in more detail later, but first I want to talk to you about the basic concepts of your work: labor, value, alienation, etc. Are you with me?
Oh yes, I'd be delighted. And then I'd be curious to see how my analysis are relevant today, or whether they are not so interesting anymore.
Perfect. See you next time.
See you around.